Rockies provides a safe and quiet respite from the pain of addiction. We have over 47 years of treating addiction, and we have fostered a generation of long-term recovery who supports our clients and families for a lifetime. Harmony staff at all levels of the organization work together to create a community of recovery support that is long-lasting. We are a 70-bed residential treatment program, and we offer a full continuum of care beginning at detox through transitional living. To learn more about Harmony, we invite you to visit us at harmonyfoundationinc.com. And if you know someone who needs access to treatment right away, we invite you to give us a call at 866-686-7867. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start the webinar. Today's webinar is approved for 1 NADAC credit. We ask that you please be sure to complete the online evaluation at the end of the webinar. You will receive a notification by email. A certificate will be emailed to you once we receive the completed survey. If you don't receive the certificate by Friday, please contact Christy Weeks at cweeks@harmonyfoundationinc.com. I believe that Dr. Barnes is going to have the slide deck available in a PDF form. If you're interested in accessing that PDF, he will give you instructions on how to get in contact with him at the end of his presentation. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Barnes. Dr. Barnes' area of clinical and research interest has been on the impact of traumatic events on family systems for many years. At Florida State, he completed his dissertation on the secondary trauma of parents of children who experienced an injury that required critical care treatment on a pediatric intensive care unit. He has written numerous scholarly articles and chapters in academic textbooks to expand counselor understanding of a family trauma and how best to treat this issue. Over the years, Dr. Barnes has recognized that the family members of addicted individuals are required to live through a number of traumatic and life-threatening situations that are so often a part of an active addiction. Dr. Barnes is in private practice with Timberwolf outside of Denver, Colorado, and he's going to be speaking for us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to him right now.
Okay, thank you, Gina. Thanks for attending. So I have the really good fortune to be able to work with families in recovery a lot, and I do a lot of educating and a lot of lectures, and this presentation has been evolving over a significant amount of time. And so often families will say, you know, I just wish my loved one would get sober so that we could go back to normal. And so, you know, this idea of normal and what is it, and it's my opinion that when we look at family stress theory, that normal is what the families are experiencing right now, that there's no going back to normal, and that if we're going to help families get better and to make changes, that we need to help them create a new normal. And not only do we need to help them create a new normal, but we need to recognize when they're being impacted by the active addiction of a loved one and when they're being impacted by the addiction or by the trauma and addiction from previous generations. And so we'll kind of talk about both of those and some clinical issues that can be helpful as well. On this slide, you see a quote from a mother of a 20-year-old heroin addict, and it just reinforces the belief of how much trauma families experience. And you know, that idea of I can sit here calmly now and talk about it, but when I don't know where my daughter is, or I'm getting phone calls about her being beaten or raped, it's really terrifying. And the last statement that she made was, you know, I think there must be some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder for families going through this. And I did a survey with 260 family members a few years ago, and one of the questions that I asked them was that is living with an addict traumatizing for the family members? And 74% strongly agreed that it is, and 21% said that they agreed, so that 95% either agree or strongly believe that living with an addict can be traumatizing. And so to treat it as less than that, I think does a disservice and actually allows the family to stay very stuck in their current status. The next slide is really about just a reminder that anyone who experiences a traumatic event, witnesses a traumatic event, or learns about a traumatic event of someone that they love can experience their own post-traumatic stress disorder. And when I work with families, that this becomes very clearly the case. And the last bullet on this slide was really written and included in the DSM-5 to address the needs of first responders and police officers and such. But I think it really applies to the families that we work with. And it says the experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. And when you talk to family members and ask them how many have ever had to kind of live with an overdose, how many have had to to rush to the hospital to address some kind of medical crisis or automobile accident, that families who live with actively using addicts experience repeated and extreme exposure to traumatic events on a fairly regular basis. And so I again just include this to say that when we talk about trauma, and for those who work in the treatment environment, we talk about trauma-informed or trauma-integrated addiction treatment, that if we don't include the family in this, we actually set the family up to fail when they leave. And so in another research project that I did with families, I asked, these are families of individuals with mental health issues and addiction, I asked them what were the things that were most traumatic for them. And they talked about the shattered dreams associated with this person seems to be getting worse rather than better, and that they're never going to be who we thought they were going to be. Dangerous and out of control behaviors, legal involvement, emergency room visits, suicide. That there are just so many things that if we don't ask the families what seems to be the most traumatic things for them, we miss a really golden opportunity. And so, the title, Creating a New Normal, we have to really understand the existing normal before we can help them create the new one. I show the slide that you can see right now in my lectures to families all the time, and we talk about homeostasis, and that picture is supposed to be a mobile over a baby's crib. And when we kind of talk about that, we look at the influence of how do they cope on a daily basis with intoxication, anxiety, hyperarousal, intrusive thoughts, trauma symptoms of nightmares, dissociation, the common family issues of anger and conflict. And they really begin to recognize how they have very set patterns for dealing with each of those. And I always ask them that if your loved one walks in the front door of your house and you notice them, how long does it take for you to determine whether they're intoxicated or not? And the average answer is 2 seconds. And we kind of joke a little bit about how that's fairly hypervigilant, but then we kind of begin to look at that they have this very unconscious, automatic, in many cases, autonomic nervous system-based response that is unspoken and is really part of an unconscious normal that that they had to adjust to in order to create safety. And so traditional addiction treatment has really looked at, we need to treat the family to support the recovery efforts of their loved one. And I'll go to the next slide. But what's missing is that many of these family members have their own trauma. And then if we really want to look at how does the family that we're currently treating, how did they create normal? How did they create their way to respond to their loved one? That when you look at this slide, you see that there are actually about 7 various families from multiple generations that have impacted how the family that I'm treating today creates normal. And they do that through a variety of kind of normalizing and what in family therapy we call organizing principles that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And so that if we kind of look to the next slide, we begin to look at the genogram, and we begin, this was a genogram of a client that I worked with several years ago, and how you look at things like trauma being present in each generation prior to the patient. The patient is Michael at the bottom of this slide, the 22-year-old, to see that his mother had trauma and her mother had trauma, and you look at his father was an alcoholic, and that his mother was an alcoholic, and the idea that we have to start understanding family response as a transgenerational response, and that I've been finding it really successful in my practice to begin to challenge family members other than the patient that has been recently released from treatment to begin to do their own genograms and to begin to investigate in their families what have been some of the secrets, what are some of the unspokens, because their organization is very significantly impacted by what they learned as a child and what their parents learned in their families of origin. And I know in my own family there's, in our genogram when we went back, that there's alcoholism in every generation since our family came from Ireland in 1860, and to begin to really look at how that has impacted everything to my own family at this point, in the traumas that we've had as well. So the idea of a new normal is we have to assess what the previous normals were and then begin to help them to challenge their belief systems for the future. The next slide is really, we often talk about, well, how do we create normal? And so this is a slide that really addresses how do memories happen during times of high emotional arousal. And the point is that sensory information comes in through the thalamus, and that information gets sent to the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, as well as to the limbic system. And the key to the slide is that if we listen to van der Kolk's concept, and I think it's really true, that what we really remember are the sensory triggers that were being experienced at the time of the trauma. The Broca area of the brain, which has to do with language, is offline the more frightened we are, the more anxious we are, and so that we don't develop that that narrative very well. And Eric Gentry, a friend of mine from Florida, says that our job as therapists when working with trauma is to fill in the gaps of the narrative memory, not necessarily to create a new memory or to discount the old memory, but to enhance it and to begin to build a change in perceptions so that they have more options. And I show this slide simply to say that all of those sensory triggers are housed in our unconscious. And most of us don't realize that we spend 80% of our time is actually spent in the unconscious mind, and only about 20% in the conscious mind. And when we talk about to families and about how they react to the addiction of their loved one, that it's really important for them to begin to recognize that these sensory triggers, we'll talk about epigenetics later, but attachment and childhood traumas of ACEs and the rules and organizing principles that they grew up in are actually carried over far more unconsciously than they are consciously. And if I can challenge my families to begin to look at their families of origin and where they learned to communicate, where they learned about affect regulation, where they learned about how to communicate emotionally, that they realize that most of that was learned and impacts them today and how they're going to either support or not support their loved one's efforts at active recovery. The next slide is really about the organizing principles that if 80% of our reactions are based on unconscious processes, as a therapist, the only things I really have to work on are the things that I can observe in session. And so these are the 5 things that I tend to spend most of my time with, and that's kind of managing what Peter Steinglass identified in The Alcoholic Family many, many years ago as he identified 4 R's, and some colleagues of mine identified a 5th. So the rules and roles, rituals, routines, and relationships, and helping people begin to recognize that the roles that they established were probably established in generations prior to them. The idea of communicating honestly versus keeping secrets, the rules about emotion, the expression of emotion, the expression of discontent, the ability to be honest. So what are the rules? And I'm going to give you in this handout a couple tools that I use to help families really assess these that really I have found invaluable in helping them to begin to create a new normal. And so the roles, who are the decision makers, issues about parenting. Do we have parentified children who are actually raising the younger children? Do we have kind of informal, kind of emotional incest in which, because of addiction, parents actually overshare information with their children, causing kind of longer term complex trauma related issues? Routines. Do people really know what is expected in the family? And are the routines about enabling, or are they about responsibility? So we could go through all of those, but these are the things that families organize around and that allow the therapist to kind of glimpse into what their normal actually is. So I think that there are 4 ways that trauma is transmitted and addiction is transmitted through the generations. So I'm going to just go through each of those pretty quickly. And the first is epigenetics. It's most of you, I'm sure, have read about epigenetics at this point. And it's the idea that genes can, it's not the alteration of the actual DNA, but how does the environment that one lives in alter the functioning of the DNA? And that picture kind of shows a process called DNA methylation, the idea that during times of high stress, these little methyl proteins attached to the histone tails, and if you can remember how DNA functions, and the helix like tightens and loosens to activate or deactivate, that actually interferes with the DNA's ability to serve its purpose. And so there are many studies. The first study I ever read, it wasn't a study, it was an article, and it was called "Your Grandmother's Trauma is Impacting You Today." And it was a description of some researchers at McGill University who had begun to study rats and to begin to show that rats who are raised in highly stressful environments actually show significant struggle with affect regulation. And that if they were placed with rat mothers who were highly nurturing, that those methyl proteins, those little yellow pentagons that are shown in the picture, actually go away. And so the Roman McDonald's, Farron, and Pollock study was the first done with children. And they found the exact same thing with children, and that children who were raised in environments that were maltreating or were highly stressful actually had these little proteins, these DNA methyl proteins that attached to the DNA. And what they found was that these kids actually had fewer glucocorticoid receptor sites, which are really where cortisol and stress hormones are processed, and that they found that from one generation to the next generation, that these kids could have these proteins and actually be born with the inability to regulate emotions as would be appropriate. And there are really 3 populations that have been studied pretty extensively: Native Americans, and I give you some references. Yellow Horse Braveheart is a person who's written in that area a lot. Holocaust survivors. Most recent study I read on Holocaust survivors were that 4 generations post-Holocaust, when they studied the great-great-great-grandchildren, that they processed stress hormones as if they had post-traumatic stress disorder, as opposed to their cohort in the control group who did not have that Holocaust survivor experience, processed stress hormones in a more normal way. And then the last group is the African American families with slavery and its aftermath. And so this idea of epigenetics, Van der Kolk's new book has a whole section on it. I actually got an email the other day about a research little consortium with high school students, and it was all on the epigenetics of addiction. And so there's a lot of research that's being done in this area, and I think it's going to shed a lot of light in the future about how when people say, well, my mother and father weren't addicted, and when I say, well, which one of your grandparents was, and they say, oh yeah, my mom's dad was, this idea that that much of this process can be transgenerational. The second kind of transgenerational trauma that I look at is attachment, and that's such a big issue right now and something that's so popular. But where I look at it from a transmission of trauma perspective is the idea that parents can't give their kids what they don't have. And so if we really look at attachment between parent and child as a form of dyadic emotional regulation or mutual emotion regulation, that we not only learn to be connected, but we learn to have our relationships from our earliest childhood connections. And research done in '95 really kind of talks about that. If we look at the attachment style of our parents, that there's an 80% connection between the relationship style that they have and what they have with our interactions with them, so we can predict that my attachment is going to be similar to the adults in my life. So even though attachment with kids can really change, it's hard to change, that it really can begin to kind of be altered. And I always think about Porges. Many of you have read Stephen Porges's work on the triune brain and the polyvagal theory and its association with parasympathetic response and dissociation. But Porges wrote an article in 2007 that really looked at attachment and how does the vagus nerve apply. And as a former counselor educator, when talking about attachment, this idea from the moment that we're born, the adults in our lives are either reinforcing that our needs are valid and that people can be trusted. And Porges says there's a really biological process that ties this together. And he cites Jackson, who as early as the late 1800s developed his theory of dissolution that says, under stress, the human system tries its newest defense system first. Humans will initiate social engagement first. If that doesn't reduce stress, it will initiate the fight-flight. If that doesn't reduce stress, it will initiate immobilization or dissociation. So if you look at the bottom picture on the left side of the screen, all of those nerves along the side of the face, that's the ventral vagal nerve. And it's Porges's belief that in our earliest days, when assessing our environment for safety or not safety, that the nonverbal and verbal, the tone of voice, the welcoming tones of our adults that take care of us are kind of processed through that nervous system, and that the child will always try to be relational. I have a 5-month-old grandson that I am just loving kind of watching him make these very social connections. And when parents coo and mimic the child, that it's Porges's belief that the ventral vagal system sends the message that this is a safe process, that we can begin to trust them, and we can disinhibit, or we can inhibit the fight-flight response, and we can inhibit the parasympathetic dissociative response, and that we can really allow ourselves as children to begin to trust. And Porges would then say that if the individual adults in our lives do not support safety, that our first line of defense will be the fight-flight response or the sympathetic nervous system response. And then if that doesn't work, that we will become dissociative. And it's his contention that we pass transgenerationally the attachment that we have been able to develop onto our children, and the traumas that we have experienced impact that. And so often, what are the clients that we see in addiction treatment? Individuals who are in constant fight-flight, who dissociate very freely. And so our treatment really addressing attachment issues is also really critical. Adverse childhood events, the ACE study, most people are very aware of that. The idea that living, I'll jump to the 10 ACE issues, but living in an environment where there's been abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, emotional and physical, domestic violence, all of these issues, that it impacts the nervous system response, it impacts learning, and that we become traumatized by that. And then the final one, and I think really the most important one, is that we pass on trauma through the organization that we have for our family, our normality. The person on the left and the person on the right in this slide come from a family of origin that is multi-generational, and that it is their experience of growing up with that family that impacts the rules and roles, rituals, the organizing principles of that family, and that when they come to us to treat addiction, that again, if we don't recognize the family organizing principles, that they will never be there. So think about the story of there are three things that can happen when one individual in the system changes. The system will either grow and go into a health or into a recovery perspective, or the family will put great pressure on that person to change back. And that individual then is forced with the dilemma of, in order to live with this family and to function within their expectations, I have to either drink or I have to leave. And so oftentimes, and I've had family members who would say they're really frustrated with AA, that it's taken their children, their adult children, away from them. And so it's really important for us to treat those parents and to treat those partners whose primary, in family therapy we call it isomorphism, the idea of I want you to join me in my reality rather than me shifting my reality to the one that is more healthy. So the slide that's up right now is very convoluted but really fabulous in my mind theory of family stress, and that it kind of sets up the idea that if we're going to create a new normal, we have to understand exactly what created the previous normal. And so if you look at the model, the pre-crisis trauma, the family really is functioning from a place of what is my perception of what the stressor is and what's the best way to resolve it. And then based on their perception, they will utilize existing resources to be able to try to resolve it. As therapists, so often we spend a lot of time trying to build resources for families and then get frustrated when they don't use them. And so it's been my perception in working with families that if we don't get to really fully understand the perception and how they're defining the problem, that providing any sort of resources is really kind of not a waste of time, but a point of frustration. And that if in stress theory, a crisis is simply defined as a stressor or a problem that is unsolvable, that the family has not been able to solve. And so every family with addiction, the addiction becomes a crisis that if they could have solved it, they would. And so people get to us in most cases in the post-crisis trauma phase, where there's this significant pileup that they experience as a result of being unable to solve the crisis. So pileup, think of the families that you work with. That pileup is all the presenting problems, legal problems, social problems, emotional problems, marital issues, parentified kids and problems. So as a therapist in private practice, a lot of times people get to me not because of the trauma, but because they have an acting out teenager or something along that line. And so as the addiction gets worse, as the trauma gets worse, the perceptions begin to change, and people get more and more organized around keeping the trauma or keeping some semblance of control about the addiction, and then resources tend to go away. So I've included in the next slide just a list of perceptions and resources that you can begin to look at. So how do perceptions get formed? Family of origin, personal trauma, adverse childhood events, personal addiction, culture, race, religion, and that all of these factors we need to assess in order to be able to understand how the family defines the problem. And then resources, intellect, emotional intelligence, secure attachment, autonomic nervous system regulation, that some families come to us with significant recovery capital, and some come to us with almost zero. So rather than looking at rehabilitation, for many families, we're really looking at habilitation. How do we build the resources that they can use for recovery? But if we don't help them change the perception of what the problem is, or perception of potential options, all the resources are not going to be utilized. So the rest of this kind of lecture is really going to be much more about how do we change perception. So Cornell and Barato developed, they were professors of mine at Florida State, developed a model called the family distress model. And it was their thought that families in crisis will either seek social support and assistance, or they'll organize around the problem. And in the research that I did with them, we began to realize that the earlier in the process following the crisis that they seek social support, the more successful they're going to be at kind of engaging in therapy. That the longer they go with a crisis unsolved, that the more the process on the right-hand side becomes a reality, where they withdraw from social support. They become preoccupied with the crisis. They think about it all the time. Their patterns organize around it. So the crisis becomes necessary for the family to stabilize. And so that idea of this isn't my problem, this is the patient's problem or the addict's problem is really a consequence of that family organization. So if we go back to this model, everything you see in green, most of the time when families get to us is really they've already organized around the problem. And so that the reality is not a reality that was necessarily from the past, but has been forged by trying unsuccessfully to get this issue to be resolved. The next slide is really, it comes from research that I did, that when families organize around the problem, you see two primary major issues. One is triangulation, where family members get triangulated and everyone's kind of trying to solve the problem except the person at the top of the triangle, the one who's actually in with the addiction in most cases. And I had a family member yesterday give me a great example of how the father keeps secrets from the mother and some of the siblings take the father's side and the mother's side. And she told this very elaborate process of coping. And when we looked at who's the only one in the family that hadn't changed at all, it was the brother who was the addicted individual. They tend to have very rigid boundaries where information is very hard to get in or information to come out. They have very diffuse internal boundaries, a lot of enmeshment, parentification, oversharing of information. And what that really promotes is a lot of secrets and a lot of covert rules. So these are things that we're going to have to begin to deal with pretty quickly. And then the next slide is really from a research project that I did with families, where I asked them if they had to describe what it's like to have an actively using addict or someone with a mental health issue to someone else, how would they describe it? And these were the things that when I coded it, that the families talked about, and I show this to families every other week when I do my lecture, and they always really support that this is a very, very consistent part of their experience. So when they organize around it, they organize behaviorally, they organize around it from a perception standpoint, but they also have significant personal response. And one of the things that my research has really been on is there a true secondary trauma? And I don't have time to go into that right now, but the thing that I'm going to challenge for you, and so I think the slide that's up right now, if you just look at those issues, those are all things that have to be resolved when working with that family. But where I've really been thinking about is that we so often use the term codependency. And if we're going to help the family shift in like how they address the problem, I think we need to shift it to be looking at more of a complex trauma response. The work that's being done by Courtois in Maryland and Ford in Connecticut, and certainly Vander Kolk has been really big on the issue of complex trauma. But if you look at the definition of codependency and you look at the definition of complex trauma, they're really the same thing. And so again, I include this, and I'll be happy to send this to you so that you can spend a lot more time sort of studying these slides. I know there's a lot of content on it and with a limited amount of time, but the more we talk about codependency, we really miss the opportunity for people to begin to do somatic work for complex trauma. And it really changes the kind of therapy that we begin to do. And then just some tools. This is when I think about doing work with a family with addiction and trauma, I think about addressing the pile-up issues first. What are the immediate issues that need to be resolved? And in doing so, I can create a safe working relationship. I can teach them to begin to look at their autonomic nervous system response and begin to work on some attachment-related issues, I can begin to really shift the perception and understanding of the problem, and the rules and all that. And then ultimately we can begin to tell the story of the various traumas and develop a healing theory. So there's a model that I'll give you. And if you're interested, I'm happy to send a chapter that Charles Figley and I wrote on working with traumatized families that really spell out the issue of how do we help people tell the story in a way that actually heals it. We all know patients that have told the story 1,000 times and it doesn't seem to make any difference. But there are certain ways that we can do that. And having been through therapy after a significant family trauma of my own, what struck me was how different everyone in our family remembered the event. And so there's a model called the family empowerment model that is on the last couple slides that really can help the family resolve the trauma. But if we don't do the previous work first, creating the new normal and creating new ways of interactions, we'll never get to the trauma. So students will often ask me, why do people change? And I think if you look at the second bullet, people change when they begin to understand that the problem that they're trying to solve isn't the one that they have. I think we're programmed that based on how we understand the problem, that we will continue to try the same things over and over again, which is what creates a lot of the normal beliefs that families have. And it's a lot of what families continue to do that creates the organization. So when families can experience their problem in unique or different ways, when they can begin to recognize that maybe the problem isn't my loved one's, that he's the addict, he's the one that has to make all the changes, but that my own trauma and my own family's addiction has really impacted the way I react with them, and that if I can get into recovery, that the whole family can begin to heal. Now, certainly there are environmental conditions that either support that or don't support that, and that's where the resources come in. And if we can begin to help them navigate the environment and finances and insurance and treatment and all of that, it's really helpful. And then helping them to have a reason to change. So when I say for families to experience problems differently, I believe that it's the experience of therapy that actually helps them to begin to change their perception, which allows them to change their experience. So I look at changing perceptions in two ways. One is creating a learning opportunity to develop new insights, psychoeducation, and how I ask certain questions, but also doing experiential work and therapy. And sometimes it's very simple kind of interventions that actually allow them to experience one another in ways that they've never experienced, or to talk about problems with one another in ways that they've never been able to talk. And so when I look at kind of task interventions or asking people to practice things differently, I am a huge advocate of giving homework. No one ever leaves my office without tasks that they're to do, assignments. Some are written, some are experiential, and that really challenge the family to have to come back the next week and begin to talk about not just what they did differently, but how they experienced it differently, how it changes their understanding of the problem. I do a lot of enactments in therapy where I, rather than giving a homework assignment to go resolve something, that we do it in session, asking them to practice some new behavior, some new technique, and I'll show you at least one of those here in a second. Unbalancing, I move people around the session, I move around the session, and we'll kind of support people by sitting beside them. There will be times where I'll actually step out of the room, while not out of the room, but back out of the center of the circle while they're talking, so that they can experience having a conversation without me present. But for me, any kind of structural intervention where we're asking them to experience things differently can actually promote safety in the experience in the session. My favorite, the picture that you see right now, is a very large picture that is on my wall in my office. And I'm a huge believer in somatic therapy and resourcing DBT, teaching DBT skills. And when I'm working with a family and I notice that anyone is becoming activated, they're fidgeting, they're beginning to dissociate, I ask the whole family to begin a moment of mindfulness and to answer those 4 questions. What are you thinking? What are your cognitions? What are you feeling emotionally? What are you feeling in your body? Beginning to help people begin to just stay with the discomfort. And then what is their impulse? And oftentimes they'll be able to talk about, I'm beginning to think that this is going to be a conversation that's too difficult. I'm getting scared. When they look at the body, they feel that their chest is tightening, their throat is tightening, and the impulse is to start an argument or something that will deflect the discussion. And most of the families that I work with right now, when I say, okay, let's go to the picture, they know exactly what we're going to do. And it's been a really successful way to keep the anxiety and to keep the affective response and the conflict down. We don't argue nearly as much as we did before because they're beginning to make a connection between their mind, body, and their impulses and what they want to do. So again, I'd be happy to share that picture with you if you're interested. So when I work with individuals, I'm a somatic therapist working with individual trauma. So I'm desperately trying to teach that family to make that mind-body connection that, it's their own responses that are keeping them stuck, not necessarily all just disagreement. These are some of the questions I love. DeShazer from Solution Focus did the formula first session assignment where he asked people that what are the things that they don't want to change in therapy? What are the things that are already going well? And it was DeShazer's belief, and I agree, that families often come in so demoralized and so black and white in their thinking that it's either going to be successful or a failure, and to begin to plant the seed that there are some things. I always tell families that they need to acknowledge their wins, that just the fact that they're together is a positive step in that. And so we're not going to try to change everything. We're going to just try to change the things that need to be changed. A crystal ball analogy. If I had a crystal ball and could look into the future when therapy has been successfully completed, how will they be different? Constructivist questions. These are my favorite. Asking people to think about things that they typically don't think about. Who do you think will be the first person in your family to notice that you've already started to change? And it forces them to have to begin to look at, well, what are my various relationships? Who are the people that think I have a problem in certain ways? And there's all kinds of constructivist questions that we can begin to construct that get them to think and perceive the problem in ways that they just never even dreamt of. Scaling questions, we all know the scale of 0 to 10, and that idea that really combats black and white thinking. Many of you might have heard the concept of contraband words, that people will talk about love and trust as if everyone agrees on the same understanding. And a lot of times, and always as a sitting behind the mirror watching students do counseling, when a client goes, and the counselor goes, yeah, I understand. I always think, what a missed opportunity to get that person to go deeper. So I will always say, I understand what that means to me, but I'm not exactly sure what that means to you, and I don't know if your family all understand it or not. So tell me what it would look like if your family started to trust you again, and what would that feel like? And then have the family begin to talk about that. Two-sided reflections, what I dialectical thinking or inherent paradox. I was in a session the other day where I heard a person say, I really love my wife and I really want to stay with her. And on the other hand, I heard him say, but if this, my drinking actually is having the right to make the decision to drink or not drink is really my priority. And that idea of that they're really dialectical thinking. I'll do anything to stay with this person, but my drinking is more important. Future questions, I feel that when people are really stuck, the idea of asking them, so, if we're not able to get past this, what's it going to look like in your family a year from now or 2 years from now? And it begins, to make them be much more motivated when they think, I don't want to go through another year of that, but to begin to look at developmental issues, like If the drinking gets worse, what's the next step? Or the opiate addiction, is there an overdose in our future? Or those kinds of things. So we begin to, by changing the perception, we can also begin to look at, so where did their ideas come from? And often they came from previous generations. So this is the tool for assessing organizational health. Again, I'm happy to share this, but these are the questions that I go through with I could actually do a page on each of these, but asking them, where did your family values come from? Where did they originate? Parents, grandparents, how have you taught your kids about these values? I did an exercise with a group the other day where I asked them to identify the values that their families held, and half of them couldn't identify any values. They said they have no idea. And so important to begin to plant that. The same way with rules. What do they do with secrets? What do they, how do they deal with complaints? How do they deal with emotions? And it goes through that, the roles and the relationships. So again, I'm happy to share this, and you can begin to use this as a way to assess sort of organizational health. And I have a worksheet that I include with that. And I have the families that I work with do this exercise where they look at the values from their family of origin. What was it like growing up in their family? And then what was it like just before they came into treatment, and what would they like it to look like when they, when they're finished with therapy. So again, creating a new normal means creating changes in all of these areas. And it may not even be a change in values, it may be a return to values. And then the last thing is really looking, that I wanted to share with you as a resource. And so there are two really good books. Charles Figley wrote Helping Traumatized Family back in 1989. He was my mentor at Florida State. And then he and Laurel Kisher, who's a professor at the University of Maryland, did the second edition of the book. So if you work with traumatized families, the first book talks about the model that I'm going to just talk about briefly. The second book actually talks a lot about family coping and how to help people sort of move through those processes. And these are this is a model that I would only use once the family has altered their perception of the problem, and that they don't have a lot of active trauma symptoms and a lot of arguing going. Again, in the chapter that I could send you, it'll explain it in significantly more detail, but we want to have the family members begin to tell the story in a way that they've never told it, a way that's not interrupted. They don't have to defend themselves, they don't have to explain, but to tell their story. And when all of the members of the family have a chance to tell their story, they begin to realize just how incredibly different they are. But they can also identify that there are some very consistent themes across all of those. So the second phase is, once they've told the story, is to begin to reframe it, helping the family begin to develop a consensus about what are the similarities and what are the differences, and begin to talk about the differences associated with the context, maybe where someone was in the process, so that each family member is urged to discuss aspects of other family members' recollections that appear to be important to them. And again, we as a family found that to be incredibly helpful, that idea of, I never realized that you felt that way. And I always thought we were all in agreement in what happened. The third one is the development of a healing theory, and this is the most important. And this is where individuals are challenged to construct this theory that's based on 5 healing questions, so that it enables individuals to understand the events and the impacts, and to develop a sense of unified kind of understanding of the issue. And the 5 questions, and I use these questions all the time, are: what happened? Why did it happen? Why did we act as we did during the event? Why have we reacted as we have since the event? And how will we react if something similar were to happen in the future? And again, you can use this with a traumatic event, but I find if we take the event out and just talk about the addiction, that when the arguments have all stopped, that the family can begin to realize that it's an illness, that we did the best we could. Maybe it was why we acted as we did was because of our family of origin. So feel free, use these questions very significantly. And the last phase is really then to help the family kind of transition out of therapy. So to leave a few minutes for questions, I did put my contact information. If you send me an email and letting me know that you were on this conference call, I'll send you the PowerPoint. I'll send the articles and anything else that you've seen that you might want, like that picture or something like that. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Barnes. Waiting to see if anybody's interested in providing us with any questions to his content today.
And I know that's a lot of material, and I will be presenting at several conferences throughout the summer on this topic in an expanded version. So.
While we're waiting for folks to type in, do you want to share with them a little bit about your new private practice that you've opened up and where it's located?
Sure. For those who don't know me, I was the clinical manager at Cedar, which is a treatment center in Denver, and ran the residential program there, and I implemented a trauma integrated treatment program, and so I've taken all of those things and really built a private practice that works with people in early recovery, but also works with their families. And I work with very significantly severely traumatized families where there have been like long-standing addiction that had lots of trauma involved, overdose, hospitalizations. But I also work with a lot of families that have had traumatized children, car accidents, bicycle accidents, intensive care experiences. And so I'm located in Lakewood, Colorado, which is actually the westernmost suburb, very adjacent to Golden before you get into the mountains. And my wife and I are in practice, and she is a trauma therapist who works with addiction as well, and works a lot with helping people to manage their own addiction and trauma issues so that they can have trauma proofing, like kind of trauma proofing your kids kinds of things. So
we do have a question that came in from Kaylin. She's asking, can you share a bit about how you coach families to share their generational trauma stories with the youngest members of the family, and at what age?
So I don't do anything with anyone under the age of 5. So like that last model that has the families talking about that, the various traumas, 5 or 6 would be the youngest. What I find is that if I do a really good job in working with the presenting problems, some of the build-up issues, that my focus is going to be on getting them to alter the way they communicate to begin with, and to begin to really, I'm always questioning about, so where did that idea come from? And what was it like in your family of origin? So they've already begun to talk about their family of origin and how it informed their perception of the problem really from the very beginning. And that I find that, and this is why I don't ever work on traumatic events, specific traumatic events, until I'm very confident that that family will engage in that process without going backwards. And so I find that having them do their own genogram and then talk about it in session where they can talk about secrets and that kind of crazy uncle that no one talked about translates very nicely into talking about specific transgenerational trauma when we're ready to open that door.
Great. I don't think anyone else has any other questions. If not, you have Dr. Barnes' contact information. You can certainly reach out to him if other questions arise after the webinar. Thank you, Dr. Barnes, for your time today and for your excellent presentation. It was very, very informative and I think helpful for a lot of us. For those of you that are interested in participating in our next webinar series, it will be on June 26th. And Beck Gee Cohen will be presenting on transgender issues and addiction. For now, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all a very happy and safe Memorial Day weekend. Thank you, Dr. Barnes.
Thank you.